The night was heavy inside the city hospital. Nurses rushed from one corridor to another, voices urgent, machines beeping, doctors calling for help. In one of the emergency wards, a man lay unconscious on the bed, his life hanging by a thread. The doctors exchanged anxious looks. He had lost too much blood, and without an immediate transfusion, he would not survive. The call went out into the crowded waiting hall. "We need a donor, now." Dozens of people stood frozen, glancing at each other, whispering, but no one stepped forward. Some were afraid of needles, some were unwilling, and others simply didn't want to risk their own health for a stranger. Minutes slipped away, each second more dangerous than the last. Among the crowd was a poor man, his clothes worn, his face tired. He had come to the hospital only to ask about small work, perhaps cleaning or carrying, anything that could give him a meal that night. His stomach growled with hunger, but his heart was restless for a different reason. As he heard the desperate cries for help, something stirred within him. Slowly, almost shyly, he raised his hand. "I'll do it," he said. His voice was weak but steady. The doctors rushed him inside, wasting no time. Within moments, the blood transfusion began. The poor man gritted his teeth as weakness spread through his body. He had eaten almost nothing that day, yet he pushed through, determined not to stop. Time dragged on. Sweat covered his brow. His head felt light, but then finally the nurse smiled. The patient's pulse steadied. The transfusion was working. Life had returned to the dying man. The donor, however, slumped back in the chair, dizzy, barely able to stay conscious. Still, he smiled faintly, whispering to himself, "At least, someone will live." He had no idea that the man he had just saved was no ordinary patient. He was one of the wealthiest men in the city, a billionaire whose fate was now tied to the humble donor's act of sacrifice. And as the machines in the room beeped steadily again, a silence filled the ward. The kind of silence before destiny reveals a story no one could have imagined. He thought he was giving blood to save a stranger, but that single choice was about to change his life forever. The poor man's name was Daniel. His life had always been a battle against hunger and humiliation. Each morning, before the sun even rose, he would walk to the crowded labor market, standing among dozens of other men, hoping to be chosen for a day's work. Some days he was lucky, carrying bricks at a construction site, hauling sacks of grain at the market, or cleaning the back of a shop for a few coins. Other days he returned home empty-handed, his children waiting with hopeful eyes that he could not satisfy. Daniel's clothes were patched, his shoes torn, yet his dignity remained untouched. When others mocked him for his poverty, he answered only with silence. When some pushed him aside in the line for work, he would let them pass, whispering to himself that tomorrow might be his turn. But what made Daniel different was not his poverty. It was his heart. Even in his struggle, he found ways to help others. When he earned a few extra coins, he shared bread with another hungry man on the street. When a neighbor fell sick, Daniel carried water for them, never asking for anything in return. Some laughed at him, saying, "You cannot even feed your own family, and yet you waste your kindness on others." But Daniel believed that giving was not about what you had in your pocket, but what you carried in your soul. At home, life was no easier. His wife, thin and weary, stitched clothes late into the night, her eyes strained in the dim light of a candle. Their children, small and fragile, often went to bed with half-filled stomachs. Yet whenever Daniel walked through the door, he greeted them with a smile, hiding the pain in his heart. He would sit with them, tell them stories of hope, and promise that one day things would change. But change never came. Each season brought new hardships, rising prices, fewer jobs, and constant rejection. The wealthy employers looked at him with disdain, dismissing him as too weak, too slow, too poor. And yet, Daniel endured. There were nights when he sat alone outside his small hut, staring at the stars, asking silently, "Why was I born only to suffer? Why must my children carry this burden of hunger?" No answer came, only the cold wind brushing against his face. Still, Daniel never lost the one thing poverty could not take, his selflessness. To him, life's greatest wealth was compassion. That is why, on that fateful night at the hospital, when doctors cried out for a donor and everyone else turned away, Daniel stepped forward without hesitation. He did not ask who the patient was. He did not wonder whether he would be rewarded. All he thought was, "If I can save a life tonight, then maybe God will see my children tomorrow." What Daniel did not know was that destiny had been watching him all along. The act of giving his blood would not only save a life but would awaken a story so extraordinary that even he could not imagine how far his kindness would carry him. The hospital was in chaos that night. Alarms beeped, doctors hurried with clipboards, nurses ran in and out of rooms. In the emergency ward, one patient's condition grew worse with each passing minute. His breathing was shallow, his pulse faint. The chief surgeon barked out urgent orders. "We need blood immediately. Type O negative. Without it, he won't make it." A hush fell across the waiting area. The call echoed down the corridors, reaching the ears of every visitor, every attendant standing nearby. But when the nurse held up the clipboard and asked who could donate, no one moved. Some lowered their eyes, pretending not to hear. Others shifted uncomfortably, whispering excuses. "Needles make me sick. I can't. I've had health issues. Why should I risk myself for a stranger?" Minutes slipped away. The doctors' faces grew tense. The patient's heartbeat on the monitor dipped lower, each beep slower than the last. The air itself seemed heavy with dread. Then from the far end of the corridor, a tired voice spoke. "I'll do it." All eyes turned. It was Daniel, the poor man, his shirt wrinkled, his face thin from hunger. He had been sitting quietly in the corner, ignored by everyone, almost invisible. But when the call came, he didn't hesitate. He pushed himself up on shaky legs and stepped forward. The nurse hesitated, eyeing his frail body. "Are you sure? You don't look very strong. Donation can make you weak." Daniel simply nodded. "If my blood can save him, then take it. A life is worth more than my strength." There was no time to argue. He was rushed into the small donation room. As the needle pierced his arm, Daniel clenched his jaw, not from fear but from the determination that drove him. His stomach was empty, his body already weak, but his will was unshakable. He watched as the dark red flow filled the bag, the very essence of his life leaving him to sustain another. In the operating room next door, the billionaire's life hung in the balance. The doctors worked tirelessly, their voices tense. "Pressure dropping. We need that blood now." Moments later, Daniel's blood was connected to the patient. Slowly, the monitors steadied. A fragile rhythm returned. The chief surgeon exhaled in relief. "We've got him. Keep it flowing." But while life surged back into the unconscious man on the table, Daniel's own body grew heavy. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His vision blurred. A nurse noticed him swaying in the chair. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked urgently. Daniel smiled faintly, his lips pale. "Don't worry about me, just save him." The nurse pressed his shoulder gently, tears threatening her eyes. She had seen donors before, but rarely someone so weak, so poor, giving so much without hesitation. When the transfusion ended, Daniel slumped back, drained. He could barely keep his eyes open, but he managed a whisper. "At least someone will live tonight." In the operating theater, the beeping of the monitor grew stronger. The billionaire's heart stabilized. Color returned to his face. The team of doctors exchanged looks of relief. The patient had been pulled back from the edge of death. Outside, however, Daniel was carried to a stretcher, his body trembling from exhaustion. Yet even as consciousness slipped away, a small smile remained on his face. The people who had refused to step forward now stared at him in silence. Whispers spread, "Who is he? Why would someone like him give so much?" No one knew his name. No one cared about his poverty, but in that moment, Daniel stood taller than them all. What he did not know, and what no one yet realized, was that the man whose life he had just saved was not only wealthy, but powerful. A billionaire whose gratitude would one day change Daniel's fate forever. He thought he had given blood only to save a stranger, but destiny had tied their lives together, and soon, that single act of kindness would return to him in ways he never imagined. Daniel's head spun as he stepped out of the small room where the donation had taken place. His legs trembled beneath him, and before he could take 2 steps into the corridor, his vision darkened. He collapsed onto the cold floor. Nurses rushed to his side. "He's fainted. Get him some water," one of them called. A few attendants lifted him carefully onto a stretcher and placed him in a quiet corner of the ward. His body was frail, drained by the loss of blood and the hunger that had already been gnawing at him before he ever walked into the hospital. He found a cup of water placed by his bed. He sipped it slowly, forcing a weak smile at the nurse standing nearby. Is the patient safe now?" he asked softly, his voice trembling. The nurse looked at him with pity, but she had work to do. Yes, your blood helped stabilize him. You should rest. Daniel nodded gratefully. He did not ask for details, did not demand thanks, did not care about who the man was. For him, saving a life was enough. He leaned back, breathing slowly, gathering the last bits of his strength. Later that night, when no one was watching, Daniel quietly stood up. His legs still felt heavy, but he could not stay any longer. He had no money to pay for the bed, no reason to linger. With one last look toward the ward where the patient lay, he whispered to himself, "I pray he lives, whoever he is." Then, unnoticed, he slipped out of the hospital and disappeared into the cold night. Inside the operating room, however, whispers began to spread among the staff. The chief doctor had just returned from a meeting with the hospital's director. His voice was low, but the nurses nearby froze as he spoke. "Do you know who that patient is?" he asked. "No, sir," one replied. The doctor's eyes were wide. "That man is Adrian Cole, the billionaire industrialist. If it hadn't been for the donor tonight, he would not have survived." Shock rippled through the room. Adrian Cole's name was known across the city. His companies employed thousands. His wealth touched nearly every corner of society. To imagine such a man lying helpless on a hospital bed seemed unbelievable. One nurse whispered, "Who was the donor? Did anyone take his name?" But no one had. Daniel had left quietly, without papers, without recognition. To the hospital staff, he was only the poor man who gave blood. His identity remained a mystery. Meanwhile, Adrian Cole lay unconscious, machines keeping his body stable, his life saved by the sacrifice of a stranger he had never met. He could not yet know that destiny had bound his future to a humble man whose kindness was greater than his wealth. The poor man walked away, expecting nothing. But fate had already written his name into the life of a billionaire, and soon, the world would learn what one act of selflessness could set into motion. The city knew Adrian Cole as a man of steel. His empire stretched across continents: oil, technology, construction, banking. His name carried weight in boardrooms and headlines alike. Yet behind the polished suits and luxury cars, behind the towers that bore his initials, there was a man whose life had been hollowed out by betrayal. Adrian had built his fortune from nothing, or so the stories went. But with every step up the ladder, he discovered the darker side of power. Friends became competitors, partners became rivals, and even family members had tried to steal what was his. The more his wealth grew, the more he distrusted everyone around him. His days were filled with meetings, lawyers, accountants, endless handshakes, and smiles that never reached the eyes. At night, when the city lights glittered outside his penthouse, Adrian often poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in silence, staring at the skyline. What good was owning half the city if there was no one he could trust enough to share it with? He had once believed love could soften his life, but that too had ended in bitterness, a marriage that collapsed under the weight of greed, a son he rarely saw, a brother who betrayed him. And so Adrian grew colder, his heart locked behind walls taller than any building he owned. The irony was not lost on him. He had power to buy anything: yachts, islands, even influence in politics. Yet the one thing he could not purchase was sincerity. Every handshake, every smile, every word spoken to him was calculated, laced with hidden intentions. The night his body collapsed from illness, it had been after one such betrayal. A trusted advisor had siphoned millions from his accounts. Adrian had shouted, thrown papers across the office, his chest tightening with rage. Hours later, he collapsed alone, his assistants rushing him to the hospital. And it was there, in the cold white walls of that hospital, that his life hung in balance, waiting for a miracle. The doctors did everything they could, but the truth was simple. Without a rare blood donor, Adrian Cole's empire would have lost its king. In that moment, surrounded by machines and strangers, his billions meant nothing. Not one of his powerful friends, not one of his wealthy allies, not one of the people who benefited from his empire came forward to save him. Instead, it was a nameless man, a stranger with nothing, a poor laborer who had walked in from the street, whose body was frail from hunger, but whose heart carried more courage than all the businessmen in Adrian's life combined. When Adrian slowly regained consciousness days later, he felt different. Weak, yes, but also shaken in a way he had never been before. The nurses whispered about the donor, but no one had a name to give him. Adrian stared at the ceiling of the hospital room, confusion swirling in his mind. Why would someone risk themselves for me? And why vanish without asking for anything? For a man who had lived his whole life believing everyone had a price, the thought was both unsettling and fascinating. The billionaire had everything, yet trusted no one. The poor man had nothing, yet gave everything. Two lives worlds apart, now bound by a single act of sacrifice. And when Adrian discovers the identity of his savior, the balance of power will change forever. Adrian Cole awoke in the private hospital suite reserved only for the city's most powerful. The sterile lights hummed overhead, monitors beeped softly, and a faint ache pulsed through his body. But he was alive. Against all odds, he had survived. His first words were not about business, not about his empire, not about his wealth. His voice, hoarse and unsteady, rasped out a single question. Who saved me? The nurses glanced at each other nervously. Some lowered their eyes, others busied themselves with papers. It was as if no one wanted to answer. Finally, the attending physician cleared his throat. Sir, there was a donor. But he hesitated. He left without giving a name. Just an ordinary man. Adrian's brows furrowed. Ordinary man? Impossible. In his world, no one acted without motive. Yet someone had risked their own life, draining their strength for him. He pressed again, sharper this time. Find him. Days passed, but Adrian's mind refused to rest. His empire could wait. His curiosity gnawed at him like fire. He instructed his private investigators, ordered the hospital staff to dig into records, and spared no resource in his search. And at last a thread emerged, a donor logged in the system. A man from the slums. A daily laborer, nameless in society, faceless in the city. The billionaire's convoy rolled through narrow streets days later, sleek black cars contrasting against rusted tin roofs and dusty alleys. Children stopped their play, women peered from windows, and men whispered as the powerful figure stepped out of his car into the poorest quarter of the city. There, standing outside a crumbling building, was the man, clothes tattered, hands roughened from years of labor, eyes weary yet gentle. He froze as Adrian Cole approached. You, Adrian said, his voice low but firm. Are you the one who gave blood for me? The man bowed his head humbly. Yes, sir. I only did what anyone should do. Adrian studied him in disbelief. This was no wealthy ally, no ambitious social climber, no politician seeking favor. Just a man, poor, hungry, trembling from weakness, yet carrying himself with quiet dignity. You gave me life, Adrian whispered, emotion cracking through his usual composure, when no one else would. And you asked for nothing? The man looked up, his tired smile breaking through the lines of hardship on his face. Life is precious, sir. I could not watch someone die when I had the chance to help. I do not need anything in return. For the first time in years, Adrian felt his heart stir. His empire, his billions, his skyscrapers, all of it felt meaningless before this ragged stranger who had given without calculation. Tears threatened to escape his eyes, but he swallowed them back, his voice trembling with unspoken gratitude. The poor man shifted uncomfortably. If you'll excuse me, sir. My family waits. I must get back to work. Adrian's chest tightened. He saw the man's shoes worn thin with holes. He noticed the calloused fingers that once dug trenches and lifted bricks, and he realized the very person who had saved him was still drowning in poverty, still unseen by the world that had nearly let him die. The billionaire stood face to face with the man who had nothing, yet gave everything. One act of kindness had overturned the balance of power between them. But what would Adrian do now? Would he walk away, or would he change both of their lives forever? The alley was still, the crowd hushed as Adrian Cole, billionaire, feared tycoon, master of empires, stood before the poor man who had saved his life. For once, it was not the weight of his fortune or power that filled the air, but something far greater: gratitude. Adrian's voice softened, heavy with conviction. You saved me when the world I built nearly abandoned me. I will not forget this. The poor man shifted uneasily, unsure how to respond. He was not used to being noticed, let alone honored. His instinct was to retreat, to slip back into the shadows of the city where he had always belonged. But Adrian stepped closer. His words firm. The man replied quietly. Adrian repeated it as if engraving it into his soul. Rahim, from this day forward, your life will not be the same. He turned to his assistant, his voice suddenly authoritative again, but this time driven by purpose rather than pride. Find his family, secure them a home, a real home. His children will have the best education this city can offer. His wife will never wonder if food will be on the table again. Rahim's eyes widened in disbelief. His lips trembled, searching for words. Sir, I did not do this for reward. I only did what I felt was right. Adrian placed a hand on his shoulder, something he had never done for any man of business, not even his closest associates. And that, he said, his tone breaking with emotion, is exactly why you deserve everything. Tears welled in Rahim's eyes, not from the promise of wealth, but from being seen, truly seen, for the first time. For years he had been invisible, a shadow laboring in the background of a glittering world, yet now, standing before the most powerful man in the city, he felt dignity restored. It was more than a reward, it was a transformation. A man who gave without expectation was about to receive more than he had ever dreamed. And a billionaire who once trusted no one discovered the only treasure money could never buy: humanity. Adrian's gaze locked with Rahim's one last time. From today, Rahim, you are not just the man who saved my life. You are a man whose goodness I will honor, not as a charity case, but as a partner in destiny. The scene closes with Rahim's family rushing out, their eyes wide with disbelief as they hear the news. Children who once slept hungry now clung to their father, tears of joy streaming down their faces. The camera lingers on the two men, one rich, one poor, bound together by an invisible thread of sacrifice and gratitude. Sometimes the poorest hands carry the richest hearts, and sometimes saving a stranger's life rewrites your own. The story of Rahim and Adrian did not end with gratitude. It began there. As the two men stood side by side, one clothed in power, the other in humility, a silence fell over the world around them. In that silence, hearts everywhere stirred with questions. Can one act of kindness truly change a destiny? For Rahim it already had. His children would sleep in warm beds, his wife would no longer fear tomorrow, and he himself would finally taste dignity. But for Adrian, the transformation was far deeper. A billionaire who once trusted no one had been reminded of something more valuable than all his empires combined: the raw, unshakable power of humanity. And if you, yes you, were in Adrian's place, how would you repay the man who gave you life when no one else would? Would you give him wealth, comfort, opportunity, or would you go further, offering him respect, partnership, a seat beside you in the kingdom of success? But fate, as always, is never simple. Not everyone welcomed Adrian's decision. Whispers began to spread. Business rivals frowned at the sight of a poor man suddenly lifted to honor. Even among Adrian's inner circle, jealousy sparked like fire waiting to consume. Why him? Why should a beggar share in the fortune of a king? The camera lingers on Rahim, unaware of the storm that may follow. One act of kindness changed their lives forever. But will envy and greed threaten to tear it apart? The screen fades slowly, leaving the audience hanging in the silence of possibility. And then, the voice returns, steady and inviting. What do you believe? Is kindness the greatest power of all? Or is success destined to attract enemies who will try to destroy it? The music rises as the narrator delivers the closing call to action. Tell us in the comments, if you were Adrian, how would you repay Rahim? Share your thoughts, because your voice matters in this story. Don't forget to like this video if it touched your heart, subscribe for more powerful tales, and ring the bell so you never miss the next chapter. Because this story might not be over yet.